Hi, I'm Dr. David Weed, coordinator of the SOWAMS Heritage Area Project. The 17th century was a remarkable time in American history. Here in New England, it saw the transformation of the land from indigenous control to domination by the English colonists who first arrived in 1620. Join us for one of those presentations today. For more information, go online to www.sowamsheritagearea.org.
I wanted to stop here for this particular reason. So much of the history of this area is told as a colonial history. What I often do as I walk around is that Pokanoket people that were here for roughly 10,000 years before the first white Europeans showed up here. And so that means that there were people living here where we are for that long a period, and this was not a permanent settlement area for them. They tended to live in small groups of maybe 50 to 100 people at most, and to move seasonally follow kind of easiest food sources. There were probably in 1600, to pick a number, there were probably, best guesstimates are between 30 and 50, probably 40,000, what are now called Wampanoag, between Bristol Warren and over to Martha's Vineyard, Pina on the Cape. In 1615 to 1619, there was a French fishing and exploration vessel that came up Narragansett Bay, interacted with the local people, and headed out. And the historians today think that that was how leptospirosis was transmitted from these French fishermen to the indigenous people here. And somewhere between 20 and 80% of the population died out over the next couple of years because of the epidemic. It just spread like wildfire. Because it was a European disease, there was no inherent resistance to it. And it left the Pokanoket, who were one of 5 tribes that had an alliance now called the Wampanoag, left them just decimated. We'll come back to why that's really important in just a minute, but the folklore is, and I don't know that there's any physical or anthropological evidence of it, but the folklore is that this area right here, kind of where it dips down a little bit, was a burial ground for the Pokanoket who lived here for all those hundreds of years, right? And what I kind of imagine is the speed with which this epidemic hit them, and the ways in which it not only killed individual people, but it just really destroyed a culture, because it's not, it would be the children and elderly that would go first, and then it would be sort of big die-off, not unlike the pandemic we just went through if we didn't know what it was and we didn't have a way to protect ourselves, right? And so the tradition would be that you'd bury people following a certain set of rituals, there'd be a ceremony, and then life would continue. But if enough people die rapidly enough, it sort of disrupts the whole ceremonial aspect. The rituals no longer work. You have kids trying to bury their parents. Like you can just sort of imagine the upheaval that would be. So we're going to go around the corner here to Margaret's Rock in a minute, and I want you just to keep this in mind. The folklore comes from a very unreliable local historian named Virginia Baker, who was writing in the 1920s and had from what Dave and I could tell, she really did her homework, but she also had quite a vivid imagination. But the folklore is that from Margaret's Rock, walking 240 paces west, you would come to the traditional burial ground. Right? So I've pasted off, and it's somewhere right in there, but like I say, there has never been any evidence. That's not too surprising, because there are also, until interactions with Europeans, there would not have been artifacts that would be likely to survive, in for real extended periods, particularly given the way burial happened. So, one other thing I didn't mention as we were just walking up is there's some stories and some evidence for there being a stagecoach line that went through this property at some point. Apparently the stage house was right about where the entrance to the dirt road is coming up here, and then it made its way through here somewhere. I used to think you could still see some of the remnants of the tracks in here from the 19th century, but I think actually it's just where big pine trees have gone down and kind of ripped up. Looks like tracks, but it's not really. But this used to be some sort of stage path through here as well. Last thing I'm going to say about where we are right now is got more to do with the sort of natural history of this place. And if you've walked out here at all, and this runs through a lot of Warren, not just here, there's these really interesting geological conformations. So there's this ridge that we just walked past, right? And then if you go a few hundred yards over here, we're going to find another ridge, and Margaret's Rock is actually at the terminus of that ridge. And the ridges run about 6 miles north and south until they reach the Kickamuit and Narragansett Bay. They're all glacial, probably 12,000 years ago, and then a couple of thousand years after that is when the indigenous communities arrived here, right? But I think these ridges really are what define so much of the way the watershed works here, the way the natural history of this place works, and that is what really starts to shape the way that human culture kind of layers onto the top of that, right? But these ledges, they're just a bunch of glacial dumping, really is what happens, but they don't run parallel side by side. This one dives underground and this one next to it comes up, and then when this one starts to end and go back, this one comes up and goes again. So they're almost like these serpents that are just kind of, and I know it's probably not the reason, but you said you live on Serpentine Road. It's kind of like, well, maybe that's why. I think it's actually something else. It's kind of a fun thought. So we'll head up here, but if you got questions about any of this part of it, I'm happy to just chat with you, or we can talk when we get to Margaret's Rock. I'm going to keep it moving just because of the bugs. So,
Thank you.
Yeah. But if you have questions, just let me know.
Do you think that
Yep,
coincides
you
with
lead the way.
also
Past with fire for years, your trail protection.
Okay.
And maybe protected with something over the
rocks? Thank you. Go ahead, Dave.
So this is Margaret's Rock. There were a couple of questions as we were walking up just about the foliage and the trees and things here. Where we are right now was part of the dairy operation for a long time. This was all cleared. If you look at the trees that are in here, they're mostly 25 years old and younger, right? Even in the time since I started living here in 2013, this path that we just came up was really wide, and the land on both sides of it was pretty open. It had some low huckleberries, and the big taller shrub we passed is called a clethra or summer sweet, actually used historically to make soaps and things like that, but that's really taking over. It's just rocketing up. There are a couple of stands of white pine out here that are maybe 125 to 150 years old, but almost everything else is much, much more recent, and it's growing in. There was a horse farm over on the Chase side of this place until probably 6 or 7 years ago, and the horses use these trails and really helped keep it open and don't anymore. So they're the ones that are over by where you are now. But if you're interested in kind of what's growing out here, I'm happy to chat a little bit more about that. But it's pretty standard southern New England. It's white pine, oak, red oak, white oak, some hickory, ash. There's a lot of beech trees, which are one of my favorites. But those of you who follow trees, they're really taking a beating right now. So maybe 8 years ago, there was a couple of summers where we had 2 really tough droughts in a row, and we had a huge gypsy moth infestation. And the second year of that, the trees got eaten as they were leafing out, and then, as they often do, they put out a second leafing, and that got eaten, which is unusual. And as a consequence of the 2 years of drought, plus that really bad second year, a huge number of the oak trees in the woods here have been dying off in big clusters. So there's all these new open spaces. So everything's turning over really rapidly. Similar thing is starting to happen with the beech trees, because beeches grow, they often share a common root system underground. So you don't ever get one beech tree. It's really rare. You usually get 10 or 20 or 100 of them. And you can almost always tell the biggest one in the middle is sort of the mother tree for all of them. And if you go around, you can see they look really healthy one week, and you go the next week and the leaves are curled up. There's a nematode bug, fungus bug kind of thing that gets into the leaves and just sort of stops their ability to process nutrients, and they just curl up and die. So some of them are going to make it, I think, I hope, but a lot of them aren't. So not for this trip so much, but something I'd be happy to talk with people about, or go explore a little on another time, is I think the landscape here is changing so rapidly and profoundly it won't look anything like what we're looking at now in the next 20 years. I think it's going to be really, really rapid change. Much of this land out here, not where we are right now, but much of it is only a few inches to 1 or 2 feet above sea level. And sea level rise is really starting to change the swampy part of this land. It's called Birch Swamp Road for a reason, so a lot of it's pretty wet. So anyway, Margaret's Rock. It's doubtful that anybody lived right here. This was probably more a gathering place, but I do like to kind of think this would be a great place to set up a lean-to against the rock. Nice little fire in there. I've hiked out here every kind of weather, 365 days a year, snow up to here, right here, and that V is never covered. It's always open, it's always dry, right? So it's a pretty lovely spot. The place where the best guess is that the village that was here, the winter village that was here, if you go around this corner, and I'm not going to, it's a little overgrown and kind of buggy right now. This picture would have been just around this corner. This ridge goes up a little bit, and as it goes back, it drops down, and then there's a bench that's probably 100, 125 feet wide, and then it drops off again to a main trail that's kind of people can walk through. So the best guess is, and this is according to the tribal historians and some archaeologists that have been out, but also we've had a military historian who does a lot of colonial military history out to take a look at it. And that's the best guess for where that village was. And it would have looked something like this painting that a friend of Dave's project in the Pokanoket people did for us a couple of years ago. So it would have been a little group of under 100 people, maybe 50 to 100 people, staying here for the winter. Living in wigwams that were sort of spread down that bench. This is sort of a fall picture, ceremonial piece. You can see the land looks pretty open around it, and so the way that a lot of the tribes in southern New England managed their land, because they'd been here for all these centuries, is it was very intense kind of management, and the management was mostly burning. So they would do seasonal burning once or twice a year. And it was really to keep the understory down and make it better for hunting and gathering of certain kinds of things. Blueberries, I don't know if anybody likes blueberries, but they love growing in burned over places. Like, it's really good for them. So it looks like a natural landscape, but the other thing to think about is this has been a human managed landscape for a long time, right? So changing, but quite the same. So I was telling you at the last stop about this epidemic that hit the Pokanoket very, very hard and just decimated their population. And historically, the Pokanoket had a lot of tension with their western southern neighbors, the Narragansett. And the Narragansett bay is named after them. They're a very visible tribe right now. The Pokanoket are not. And after this epidemic, the Pokanoket were really worried that the Narragansett were going to use their weakened situation to take advantage of it, and they would come and take land or resources. And the Pilgrim story about Thanksgiving and all was actually part of a series of meetings that were more about creating treaty relations between the European settlers up in Plymouth and the Pokanoket who were here, and it was an agreement to protect each other if they were attacked, and they were celebrating that. It wasn't so much like we're glad about the harvest. It was like, you know, I've got your back, you've got my back, we're going to celebrate that a little bit. So it was that kind of politics, and one of the things to be thinking about is this entire region, southern New England down into Connecticut, out into western Massachusetts, even the eastern parts of New York State, full of a lot of tribes, and all those tribes had these long, dynamic political relationships with each other, always moving around. And when Europeans arrived, for all those tribes, they just became another factor in arranging all the political relationships. And so everybody's kind of moving those all around. And the British who arrived understood that, they participated in it, and everybody was mostly operating from a position of real vulnerability for a long time. So fast forward from early 1620s to 1636, that's when Roger Williams shows up here. And the story for him is he came over, he's married to the daughter of a prominent religious leader up in Massachusetts, and he starts preaching what was considered heresy and sedition. And charges are brought against him, but because he's connected, it's sort of like, just stop it and we'll pretend it didn't happen. And because he can't help himself, he keeps preaching, and an order for his arrest is put out. He hears about it. He leaves in December of 1635, ends up here in this location in January of 1636. The reason he came here was he had a long-standing relationship, as did many of the the English settlers in this area, with the Pokanoket people who were here, and particularly with Usamequin, who's the sachem, or the leader of this tribe right here. So when he arrived, the story is that, and this is in his journal and in some other sources, he probably had what was a really bad case of pneumonia. It was a cold, long winter, a lot of snow. He made his way down here, sick, and stayed here for a couple of months being nursed back to health. And I used to wonder what it would have been like for a very small band of people who were doing subsistence living to take somebody in and nurse them for a couple of months. Like, that would be a pretty big demand on your limited resources at the worst time of year to get new resources, right? And as Dave and I have talked with the tribal historians that have been out here, it's probably more likely that they had surplus resources most years that would have made that very possible. And hospitality of that kind was just a normative practice in cultural life, right? So he stays here, gets better, and then he kind of wanders down to the rest of the story, which is the founding of Providence, and picks a spot. Doesn't go so well, he gets kicked out of it, crosses the Seekonk River into Providence, and then really gets things moving. And the Narragansett are given really credit for awarding him the land that is now Providence. It's actually, according to other tribes who had an interest in that area at that time, it was actually a neutral space that was shared by all the tribes in the region, including the Pokanoket. So it wasn't the Narragansetts to give away, but they, back to this politics, they did, and it, kind of worked for them, worked for the settlers, so it's kind of, that's part of the history also. So if you look at this sign here, and the Roger Williams Family Association comes out here about every other year. I think they just called Charlie. They're going to be out sometime this fall. They want to make another visit. They usually ask me to come talk with them. Usually goes well, not always. So, we've had some pretty interesting conversations. So I have great respect for them and their sort of constancy to the history that they're a part of, and I've learned a lot from them. And I have a critique as an historian of this sign and of what I think that history means. And what I love about the Family Association is they're actually doing a really good job grappling with that. They're not resistant, they're just like, so what do we do with this? So if you look at the sign, it tells a and a lot of historic markers like this tell stories that are kind of true, and then they're sort of not so true. The other parts that are missing matter a lot. So it's got a small, tight face, Margaret's Rock, and the first thing to think about is, who is Margaret? Right? That's a European name assigned by a European speaker, probably British, to an indigenous woman, and probably because they couldn't pronounce her given name. Right? So she wasn't Margaret, she was somebody else. We don't have any record of who that was, what she was called. But she was the wife of, here by tradition, Chief Massasoit, and Margaret welcomed Roger. Well, the word Massasoit means leader, it's not a name, right? So he was a Massasoit, but his name is something else, right? So Margaret and someone who's not named, and I'm being kind of harsh about this to make a point, right? They nursed an ill Roger back to health during that very long cold winter of 1636, following his banishment from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that's kind of the history, right? So from this sign, the history doesn't start till 1636. And it pretty much erases the 10,000-year history that came before it. So there's nothing, I'm not opposed to having a sign like this. I like it to be corrected. And granted, that's a little expensive, so I'm not holding my breath. But I think that there's room for maybe another sign, or through Dave's website, just an opportunity to get a more robust history and start thinking about the complexities of what all that means. So fast forward a little bit from the 1630s to 1675, and for that probably 40-year stretch in the middle, there was relative peace between the European settlers, mostly English, and indigenous people who were here. And a lot of the reason for that peace was the relationship that Roger Williams had with Usamequin and other tribal leaders in the area. They agreed that it was better to provide mutual support to each other than to compete with each other, and they negotiated some boundaries of who could go where. One of the other things this gets into that I'm personally just most fascinated by, I really want to, when I'm fully retired, I want to really dig into, is this whole idea of ownership and how land titles are established and what it means to begin owning land and buying and selling it. So the indigenous folks who were here, the Pokanoket and others, had no concept of owning land. What they had was the closest we would come in European law would be something called usufruct rights. And usufruct rights basically just mean you own the right to use the land. So, you own the right to harvest blueberries, you own the right to hunt deer, you own the right to take trees. Somebody else, there's all these different rights. You own the right to live here as you're passing through or to travel across it. So all of these political relationships that the tribes had with each other were the bartering of rights of use. They weren't bartering ownership of land. Land was seen as something like, a lot of tribal names translate loosely into first people. And the reason for that is that we're the first people who lived here, right? And this is where we're from, so there's this idea that where we're from is who we are. And that gives us a certain set of rights of being from this place and using it, but it doesn't mean we own it. It owns us as, to use the European worldview, it owns us more than we own it. There's a wonderful book that came out maybe 3 years ago called Our Beloved Kin, which is the most thorough history of all of this if you're interested in digging in more. It's like 800 pages of meticulous research. So the idea of the title is that the worldview of the folks living here would have been our beloved kin is not only the other humans in this space, but it's the natural world around us. It's these trees. I have a relationship with these trees because I'm from this place. These are part of my extended family. I'm part of their extended family. I wouldn't be who I am if I lived in a different environment. I ate different things. I traveled differently. Water moved differently around me. So there's this kind of assumption of this intimate knowledge and relationship that's just, I find really kind of lovely and challenging, because it's like, wow, what would it mean for me to have that kind of relationship with where I live? That's kind of what I'm interested in. The part of it, though, that I'm also interested in as an historian is nobody owns the land. Europeans arrive, and the first thing they want to do is own the land. So 1675, King Philip's War gets going. It's started by one of the Massasoit sons called King Philip. And he starts it because he's recognizing in the early 1670s that if the tribes don't band together to drive out the Europeans, they never will. Sort of last gasp effort, because their numbers are dwindling, the Europeans seem to just keep coming and coming, and the new arrivals are not as respectful. These sort of negotiated truces are kind of falling apart, getting more and more stressed. And what kicks things off is the fear and the vulnerability of the local tribe here, and the sort of aggressiveness of a number of the settlers in the area for taking land. So war goes very, very badly for the tribes, and probably if, let's say, half of the Pokanoket died off in 1620, 40% of the remaining population dies off in that war in 1675. For the Pokanoket, after the war, there's only really two options. Option one is flee. And a lot of them head north to the tribes that are up in Maine. The Passamaquoddy has a lot of Pokanoket visitors who stay. The other thing that happens to many of them, though, is they're arrested, incarcerated down in Providence, and then sold as slaves in the Caribbean. So you actually find, you can trace this genetically. It's not a speculative history at all. But there's a large sell-off of the remaining folks. Laws are passed that make it against the law to practice the customs or speak the language of the Pokanoket, and that law is not repealed until the 1940s. So if I want to be harsh about it, that is what genocide looks like, right? If I want to sort of be a little more in the mindset of someone in that period in history, this is what winning looks like, right? And the other thing just to say about the enslavement is that our ideas about what slaves are still being formed in that period. So it doesn't mean exactly what black slavery means in the 19th century. It's an evolving concept, right? But this idea that you could own somebody else and sell them as a spoil of war is what's happening. So effectively, after 1675, the Pokanoket ceased to exist. And if there are still some survivors around, and there's a few, they pass themselves off as belonging to different tribes. They actually integrate. Providence has a really large free black community, relatively speaking, for the colonial cities, and they intermarry with a lot of the free black population. So it the history gets really fascinating from that point forward. King steps in. He says, "This is mine, and I'm going to make land grants." And in 1690, the Mason family has moved in the 1680s, right after the war. They're waiting. Land grant comes in 1690. They get awarded a land grant, and the Mason family owns the property until 1940, 1941, when it's sold to the Chase family. Right? This folklore is the Mason family had a good relationship with the surviving Pokanoket in the area. Allowed them rite of passage. They could camp out here, hunt, things like that. But it was a pretty truncated, narrow set of experiences. Right? So I look at all this, and those are some of the things I think about. Right? So The question I'm really fascinated by is, like, how do you tell this history? Because we don't know enough to really do a great job of it, right? But it's not that this is wrong, but it's more than, it's that and, right? And I think so many, just to sort of editorialize for a second, the parallels with so many of the questions raised by this then, and the kinds of issues we're dealing with, I think, culturally, societally right now, they're very, very intertwined. You can just see, you know, how much goes back to this history, what it means to tell that. So, with Dave, do you want to add anything? You're really I'm a pretender compared to Dave.
Just to point out a few more things, we'll have a chance in a minute to go up in this village site, but the topography, as Keith was describing, you've got this is the end of about a quarter-mile rock, and you climb up, you'll get a little idea. Best to come here when the leaves aren't out, and you can see it. You can actually see it from up above on Market Street, 136. It's a little dangerous there now, but wait till the leaves are gone. You can't see anything because of the leaves. But later this fall, you can look down the farm field, which is over there, and you will see little portions of the rock there, and you get some idea of where it is. We believe that that field was part of a whole area called Sachem's Knoll, because where Johnson's Market is, it's on a rise. It goes down everywhere around it. Okay, not steeply, but you can tell that that was the top of a knoll, and there is a granite outcropping. Again, when the leaves are off the trees, you can see a large perched rock or balanced rock, big boulder. And my archaeology friends said, yeah, it's just a glacial erratic. And my argument is glacial erratics don't decide to move a rock on the one place in this whole area that's a granite outcropping, put some stones underneath it to keep it from rolling. No one has confirmed that, okay? This is my speculation. But regardless, it makes perfect sense because that's what native people would do in a place like that, is to move, and a dozen guys pushing hard could get it up there. It's not impossible. So that we know was a ceremonial site. Across the road on Market Street, you'll see a long, of a dark rock that goes along for about 125 feet there, when all the
it's a metamorphic rock. Away. It's all just mud, pressured mud.
Yeah,
mostly.
But it doesn't look like this kind of rock. It's a smooth rock. Anyway, we have a marker there. Go to Johnson's Market, pull out and head south toward Warren, pull off the road there. There's plenty of space to park there, and then you can walk up on top of it. There's a picture on the marker if there's too much vegetation right now, and you will see where there was a groove down the middle of that rock. And Virginia Baker, among others, described that as the national grinding stone, a large rock, because the theory is that Native women would roll a rock down that groove and grind their corn. And more than likely, there were many areas around here that were cleared. The idea that this was, quote, pristine and just nothing but woods is wrong. They did a lot of land clearing by fire, burning spring and fall, and had many open areas. In fact, if you read Verrazano's account from 1524, he talks about going 20 or 30 leagues, that's like 20 miles or more, with open cleared land around here, much of which they would use for plantings of corn. They didn't plow the field. They made, you know about the three sisters, corns, beans, and squash? Okay, that's how they would plant. But it also kept the forest clear for hunting as well. So it was like a park in many ways, which is why the English were so enamored with this place. You know, coming from England, where all the land was owned by somebody above you, and you had no chance of getting land, coming here and seeing this and saying, and not having native people alive here, God has prepared the way. This is a wonderful place, and there goes the history. So, you have anything else you want to add?
The stone walls that you'll see out here if you do walk are mostly farmers' walls. It's relatively rare for the farmers themselves to build them. They hired stone builders traveling people got paid by the foot to build walls all over the place. But a lot of the walls, and I imagine a bunch of them out here, are also constructed by the tribes that lived here to keep cows and pigs out of their farmland. And the stone walls are pretty effective. Cows can't jump very much and pigs don't. So it's, kind of works. But that's about the only thing I add. Do you want to try to see what this looks like up here?
Do you know anything about Devil's Rock?
Devil's Rock is another large outcropping back in the... What do I know? It has a name. And it's famous for its devil footprints on the rock. And if you work your way through the woods and climb up on the rock, first of all, it used to be, before all this vegetation has grown in the last 50 years, Butch Lombardi, who grew up around here, who does wonderful photography, said when he was a kid, they would go there all the time because this was open and clear, and you climb up on the rock and you could see practically to Newport from up there. Okay, but now it's much more difficult to get there.
We were told, and I have no idea by whom, that it was one of the sites for the fire messages that would be passed down.
At any high place,
Yep.
Right. So you've got Sachem's Knoll up there, Devil's Rock, also Patumtuck or Mount Hope, and by a fire and the smoke that would come from that, they could get a message to Mount Wachusett or Mount Monadnock in 10 or 15 minutes. Kind of puts our cell phone problems to shame there.
The other spot right here that's thought to be one of those messaging spots, right next to the farm on Joda's property, right next to the old horse barn there, there's that big hill that's built up. That's, if you dig down a little bit, that's almost all piled up slag. And the thought is that it was a natural rise, and then it was raised about another 10 to 15 feet by the tribe just kind of bringing in stone to raise it to the point where it's visible all the way down to what's now the Sakonnet River. We can take a quick peek here. I'll just go ahead and see if I guess she married pulled by a small group of people, and it's easy access to water and food. So this would have been a really prime spot. If you can see where the land starts to drop off again a little bit here, and it's a little bit steeper as you proceed north, but that drop off is to where the main walking path is that kind of runs north and south. So this would have probably been it. So if I come out early in the morning and walk through here, or in the evening, a lot of times there'll be a cloud of 15 or 20 goldfinches that come up because they like to sit in there and just chew.
That's great.
So just a quick pause here. This field right now is just dried out winter rye. It'll be probably turned under in the next couple of weeks. Charlie and Lori lease it to Four Town Farm, and Four Town Farm usually uses it to grow squash most years. What's been interesting the last couple of seasons, though, is that they've chosen in this field to grow mostly ornamental squash, not butternut or another food squash. And the problem for them, and they like to grow food, they like to feed people, that's what makes them happy. And the problem they're running into is the price they get for ornamental squash is almost double what they get for food squash. So, they're successful farmers, which is no small thing these days. But this is probably a 3-ish acre field, and goes off over this little rise. You can see the tree line. There's other fields back there. And like a lot of farms, especially this scale, and particularly in this part of the country, there's been so much generational change. But I think we're at a moment when the transformation of farming in New England is going to really be rapid and profound. What I'm excited about personally is there's a lot of young farmers, particularly in Rhode Island. Most of them are also working other jobs. It's not a full-time living for most of them. But Rhode Island for the last decade is the only state in the union that has had a growing number of farmers year to year. No other state has. And the average age of farmers, I think nationally right now, is middle 60s. We all like to eat, so that's really worrisome. So I'm really encouraged by the number of young farmers. They mostly don't do this scale of farming though. What they do is really intensive, 1 or 2 or 3 acres at a time. So the vision I kind of like to think about for this type of property somewhere in the not too distant future is a farming cooperative that's maybe a dozen small farmers. Maybe 1 or 2 of them are also raising chickens or cow, beef or something, sheep, something like that. But who knows? It's going to be a roll of the dice over the next, 10, 20 years. So we're almost back to where we started, so we'll just continue down this way a little bit.